James Patterson had a writing contest a little while ago where he asked writers to submit their first chapter of a book that they might want to write in conjunction with him. You know that James Patterson often partners with other writers. And I entered this contest and it really had me thinking how crucial a first chapter is. So a writer, a reader, an editor, an agent, they can all tell the potential of a book from its first chapter. And this is why when I'm writing a book, I often will go back, rewrite my first chapter a million times. And sometimes I'll look at it and I'll go, I think I probably need to start my first chapter elsewhere because the first chapter does so much heavy lifting. It really is that thing that determines, how someone's going to be feeling about your book as they go into it. And so definitely any kind of attention that you spend on the first chapter is well worth it. And that's why I wanted to spend an entire episode of the How to Be an Author podcast talking about how to craft an ideal first chapter for your book. So we're going to be diving deep into all of the reasons why the first chapter of a novel is so crucial. We're going to be talking about what goes into the first chapter, what's crucial for you to have, what you might not need to have. We're going to be talking about some of the big mistakes that authors make when they're writing a first chapter for their novel. And if you're a Writing Coach on Demand member, you're going to get a very crucial set of bonus materials, which are going to be talking about how to keep the promises that you make in the first chapter of your book throughout your novel, because that's really, really important too. And don't worry, if you're not a Writing Coach on Demand member yet, you can still sign up now and then send me an email saying, hey, I'd like those materials. And don't worry, I will get them to you because I'll be so happy that you're here. So let's jump on in. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I'm writing coach Karena Akhavein, and it is one of my many jobs to make sure that the first chapter of your book is extraordinary. But of course, I do much more than that. And if at the end of this podcast, you're still intrigued about the possibilities and pitfalls of writing chapter 1, know that you'll get everything you need as well as crucial checklists and exercises in my masterclass from idea to published in 6 months. You can find that on my website, Online Courses for Writers, and you just pop into From Idea to Published in 6 months, and you can see what you get with that amazing masterclass that will change your life in much less time than you ever thought. So let's talk about why the first chapter of your book is so crucial. So you know that this is what really makes a reader decide whether they're going to keep reading or not. Oftentimes when you publish a book or self-publish a book, there's going to be sample chapters. For example, on Apple Books or on Kindle, you can download those first chapters and a reader's going to make that decision as to whether they buy your book or not from just a few pages. So this chapter needs to work really hard. The other thing is that agents and publishers also make their choices as to which books they might want to represent based on the first chapter, right? They can tell so much, but what is it that this chapter has that's so important? So as I mentioned, the first chapter is everyone's first impression of your book and of how well the author can tell the story that they're telling. So if the reader's not engaged or interested in the first chapter, there's no way, they're going to continue. And so many writers say, oh yeah, it starts off slowly, but don't worry, it gets really good. How many people do you know who are actually going to believe that after they've read a first chapter that's uninspiring? Not that many. And it might have been a thing where before you could give a bunch of info dumping and a bunch of background info, and people had a lot less options as to what they were going to spend their time doing. They had less books available. They did not have Netflix. So maybe they were going to be invested in that book. But these days, there's too much out there. So you really need to grab people at first. So it's so interesting how some of these writing tips evolve with time, and they evolve with, where we are in the history of entertainment and publishing, all of that stuff. But it's crucial to know that our audiences have less of an attention span than ever. So you really need to establish several crucial things in the first chapter, and you need to grab them. The other thing that the chapter is so important for is that it really establishes the tone. And, when people are choosing a book, oftentimes they're choosing it not just for the story, but because they're looking for a mood. So they're looking for a style. They're looking for a specific type of pacing, right? Do they want something that's dark and brooding? Do they want something that's kind of bubbly and exciting? What do they want? You're going to establish that tone early on with chapter 1 and make a promise to that reader that, hey, I'm going to put you in a specific mood as you read my book. The other thing the first chapter does is that it's introducing us to the characters. And we're, of course, going to be talking a lot more about this because this is so, so important. But, characters are crucial to readers. They want to be empathetic. Readers are going to be invested in your character, in their motivations, in what happens to them. And the groundwork for that starts in chapter 1. So I'll be talking about some of the mistakes that people do with their characters in chapter 1, but it's really crucial to introduce us to the main players pretty quickly. And we want to feel essential conflict and tension straight up front. In chapter 1, you don't need to scream it out, but we need some kind of a hint that there's going to be some kind of a conflict in the rest of your book. Because if not, where's the suspense? Where's the tension that keeps the reader engaged? Is just not there. Another really important thing that, chapter 1 has is this establishment of a setting. And we'll talk more about this. We'll do a deep dive into that in this episode, but you establish a setting and people kind of love a setting, right? Think about Harry Potter and Hogwarts. People fall in love with not only the physical setting, but the emotional setting. And, you get immersed in the world of the novel. And chapter 1, you need to start doing that right away. Because if not, then it gets a little bit too late because you won't have hooked your reader. So that's really the main message is, right? Your first chapter is hooking that reader. And we'll talk about how to hook a reader later on in the episode, but that's really what makes them keep reading. And also, a really fun thing that a first chapter could do is create some foreshadowing, giving hints as to what might come in the rest of the book. And that's kind of what I mean when I say that chapter 1 is making some promises and that you need to keep them later on. That's definitely that foreshadowing is part of that, but you need to kind of keep that promise. And that's the thing that I'm going to be concentrating on in my bonus materials for the Writing Coach on Demand members. So definitely consider that. So let's start first with talking about establishing a setting. And I'm not talking about these elements of chapter 1 in any particular order. I'm going to be doing kind of a stream of consciousness thing, but I promise I'm going to try to keep it as organized as possible. If you want to take notes, do that. If you want to re-listen to this episode, do that. But also the best place to have all of this really organized, cut and dried, including exercises and applicable checklists, everything else is definitely in my course, From Idea to Publish in 6 months. You have so much material there that you can definitely use immediately, and it's just easy access. But anyway, let's talk about establishing the setting in chapter 1. So you don't want to bog us down, right? You don't want to info dump us, but you really want to have us dive straight in. So how do you do that in as few words as possible? We start with sensory details, of course. What can the reader see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, right? This is what's going to create a vivid sense of place with few words. And you don't need to describe every element of this setting. You can give us a few crucial salient details that are going to make all the difference. So, you can describe, for example, let's say that you're trying to do kind of a dark feel that's kind of maybe a small town, out in the country, maybe in the South. You start describing the sound of those crickets chirping, right? And those crickets chirping, it's kind of reassuring sound, but it can kind of mask the creaking of the door or the creaking of that old wooden sign. There's wind lifting up. There's the smell of grass and then maybe something else in the background. There's all these visuals. There's the moon that's being partially obscured obscured by clouds. All of these things help you to weave together this very compelling image in very few details. And notice how the sensory details don't just describe, but they make you feel. So that's really important. Another thing that you kind of want to do a little bit is that you want to put the world of your book into context, whether it's historical, cultural, or emotional. So you might need to provide a little bit of a historical or cultural context to help us understand the world, but not just for the heck of it. Understanding the world is also understanding the stakes, and it also means understanding some of the constraints that your characters might have, right? So if you're writing a historical novel, help the reader to visualize okay, what is it about the architecture? What is it about the customs? What is it about the politics that might impact my characters? That's going to be really, really important. And again, we don't want a history lesson, but we do want to know, how is this environment going to affect the story? If you want us to get to know your characters really quickly, you don't want to sit there and describe them physically forever. You don't want to have this massive internal monologue for too long. You might want to use just a few snippets of that, but you also can use dialogue and actions of the character to show them in their everyday world, this world that they inhabit. That's really, really important. Just a few little exchanges or a few little actions that are well chosen can definitely help your reader to see the uniqueness of your character. So the key to setting a scene is to create this clear and vivid sense of place that draws the reader in, makes them want to keep reading. And it also is going to give us a really vivid idea of who your characters are, but specifically who they may be. We don't need to know everything about the character, but we need to know just a few of those details that set them apart. Now, let me now talk a little bit about the tone, because I was talking about how this is so important, the mood, the atmosphere. This is a super important thing to establish. So how can we do this in chapter 1 without overloading it? Because again, your chapter 1 is probably going to be just one crucial scene. That's a pretty short unit of storytelling. So how do we do that? Well, the tone can be established with language and diction. So it's kind of woven in there, right? It's something that the reader is going to feel more than being told, right? So do you have a lighthearted, more playful tone? Are you using more informal language? Do you have maybe some historical slang? Or do you have a more formal tone? Maybe some elevated language, maybe some, slightly archaic language? That's going to help to set the tone in a big way, as will some of the imagery that you might use, right? The images you use in your writing can help to establish the tone of your novel. So if you're wanting to create this mysterious, foreboding tone, you might be describing the setting in a way that makes it sound a little bit more dark, a little bit more ominous, right? And some of these elements that you're describing, we are hardwired to think that certain things are threatening, whereas certain things are kind of cheerful. And of course, you can subvert those things, but you can also use those things as shorthand. So, kind of a dark forest, or, a dark, house that seems abandoned, that's shorthand for there's going to be something creepy here, right? Conversely, you can create something that's more warm and inviting. Are we in a pretty field full of wildflowers, or, are we in somebody's comfy, dining room that, they love? That's something completely different. And again, shorthand in the imagery, and also what are the objects in your scene? Because some of them, if there's somebody wearing a poison ring, or there's somebody who's got a pet snake, you can not only use this imagery for the mood, but also for some kind of foreshadowing that can be pretty interesting, that can raise the tension and the suspense. We have, as I'd mentioned, the dialogue, right? The dialogue definitely can help to establish the tone of your novel in a big way, because think about it. Your characters can be bantering. They can be having a fight. They can be tense. They can be flirting. Whatever they're doing, this is going to be really interesting to set the tone. Absolutely. The way the dialogue goes down is really crucial in how the rest of your novel is going to be perceived. And also the pacing is important. Are you having quick scene changes, short, snappy sentences? Are things fast paced, or are we more reflective in this chapter? Are we using more longer sentences, kind of more flowery prose? This is going to establish the tone of the novel as well. And it really is important to be deliberate and intentional when you do this, right? You're carefully selecting this language, the imagery, the dialogue, the pacing, so that you can create the tone with an economy of language that is going to not drag down your book in any way, because you don't want to stuff your chapter 1 full of stuff, right? That's going to get your reader to be like, oh my God, what am I supposed to be focusing on? And that's really, really important to remember, that economy of language totally is going to be your secret when it comes to writing a good first chapter that doesn't get bogged down. Let's talk about this idea of hooking the reader, right? We need to hook the reader. We need to keep them engaged. And that means keeping them interested, right? So too many authors make this mistake. They hear that they're supposed to be beginning with action, and they're like, oh, I'm going to start my novel with a bang. I'm going to start with an action scene that's going to draw the reader in. I'm going to do something super dramatic. I'm going to do a car chase, a fight scene, whatever. Okay. That's a good thought strategically, right? And in theory, that's a really good idea. But you really need to make sure that before you start with some kind of action with high stakes, remember that you can't have high stakes if we don't care about the character. So if you're going to be having this high stakes, high action scene, remember that with economy of language, you have to make us care about the character. Even if it's just in a couple phrases, sentences, or words, how do we care about what's going on in this character in this action scene? Right? So remember that you can use the actions of your character. How do they react to this? How are they, comporting themselves? How are they speaking? What are they thinking? Okay, all of this gets us to know the character. Make it so that they're very unique in how they're dealing with this action scene. Another really great way of hooking the reader is to start with some kind of a question, right? So this question, you're not going to, start with a question that you write down, right? You're going to begin with the character maybe asking themselves something, or asking another character a question, right? And this is something that's kind of fundamental, is the crux of the whole novel or of the theme. This can be really interesting, but again, it cannot be too heavy-handed. You need to do it right so that it's intriguing, piques the reader's curiosity, but doesn't make us feel like there's going to be some kind of a essay response to this thing. It needs to be woven into the story really wisely. Another thing that you can do too is plunge us into the atmosphere of the book. And you can do this with really vivid descriptions to paint a super vivid picture of the setting or the characters. And you want to make sure that this setting has something really crucial, that it, maybe creates mystery, or maybe creates a promise of something, right? There's something that's missing. There's something that's off. There's something off kilter. All of this is really interesting. To create the mystery, the reader is going to want to start to solve that mystery or solve the problem. They're going to be intrigued. So, what's missing? What's off kilter? What's secretive? What's unsolved? All of that is going to be really important. And definitely you want to hook the reader by using a strong voice. So if you look at those books that have maybe an internal monologue at the beginning, definitely they are doing that knowing that their character's internal voice and their style and their tone is going to be compelling enough to make the reader care about what happens to this character, what their obstacles are, what choices they're going to need to make, and what they're going to learn throughout the novel, right? So definitely you want to create this interesting and compelling opening that draws the reader in, and you're going to be making choices. You don't need to do every single one of these things with the hook. I think you want to do one or two of these things and do them well. Because if you overload your reader trying to create a hook by doing everything so-called right, it's going to be ending up a little bit wrong. You don't want to do that. Providing context, again, very, very important. We talked about the setting. I talked about in the introduction, the world in which your story takes place. When we're introducing the setting, it's not just the physical setting. It's also kind of the time period, any cultural details. You want the reader to visualize this setting, but also how, the context, the characters have to be in context as well, right? What's your character's occupation? What's their age? What are their relationships? Because you want to see how things fit together. Now, sometimes you don't want to do this because you want to tease this, right, as the novel goes along. But if you're going to be teasing these elements, you want to create a question about how do these people fit together? So you want the reader to know, what am I supposed to be solving? Or what am I supposed to be caring about? That needs to be kind of clear without beating them over the head, like establishing the conflict, for example. You're introducing the main character or the problem that your character is going to face throughout the story. This is what starts to help the reader to understand the stakes and to start to become invested in the outcome. And I say start to become invested because, this investment that the reader makes, it starts with chapter 1, but it needs to continue becoming stronger as the story goes. Now, I warned against info dumping in chapter 1, especially as we're trying to provide context. Too many writers are like, yeah, but nobody's going to understand the context if I don't have backstory and this and that. And yes, I get it, but remember that the backstory, especially in chapter 1, we want it to be absolutely minimal so it doesn't impact the pacing. It doesn't impact us to, get torn out of the story, really, because when you're kind of going back, you're taking us out of the present of the action. So it's really important to remember that maybe with dialogue, really quick dialogue between characters, we can provide that context and reveal information without snapping us out of the present moment, right? The key is to provide context to give the reader enough information to understand the world and characters without overwhelming them with too much detail. So remember that it needs to remain engaging, informative without messing up the pacing. And one of the things that's really important, as I mentioned, is having that tension. The tension is so essential. And there are ways to create tension, and there are different kinds of tension. Much of it comes through conflict, right? If you're starting with a problem, introducing a problem or a conflict that the protagonist has to solve, this definitely creates a sense of urgency and sets the tone for the rest of the story, especially if you also tell us that there's some kind of a time limit, right? Having a deadline creates the urgency and ramps up the tension. That's a good thing to introduce in chapter 1 is, what is my deadline? What does the character need to get done by when and why? That's kind of the idea, right? That's very important. And I'd mentioned the foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a great thing to introduce in chapter 1, and you're definitely going to be using that to hint at future conflicts or possibilities or events. This can create a sense of unease and anticipation in the reader. And of course, just because you're foreshadowing, it can be a little bit of a red herring. You don't need to have everything you've foreshadowed actually come to fruition, but you do need to address when it doesn't happen, that it's kind of like an oh phew moment, right? I think of, in the movie A Quiet Place, I think it's called A Quiet Place, where you've got these characters and they can't make any noise because you've got these creatures that hear the noise, and you see that nail on the floor of the stairs, and they just kind of focus on this nail sticking out of the stairs, and you're thinking, oh my God, if somebody steps on it, it's going to be a disaster. Now, when that happens, the character doesn't actually make that much of a noise, but so you basically, took that foreshadowing to its logical conclusion. You also could have had something else where someone narrowly misses it, but you're making a point out of saying, yes, we created tension throughout, and it's almost a game whether you have that come to fruition or not. So that's really fun. You love there to be a sense of danger, right? And the danger could be physical danger, emotional danger, whatever, but it creates that tension and suspense nevertheless. You want the reader to worry about your character's safety, about their happiness, about their livelihood, all of those types of things. Another really interesting thing you can do to create tension is to use contrast. So create a contrast between your protagonist's current situation and either what they had or what they want or what they need. This really helps the reader to understand what kind of obstacles and what kind of a chasm lies between, what they want and what they currently have or are. That's really important. And again, the pacing really helps you to create tension, that sense of urgency, and the setting, the tone, the creepy setting, the dangerous setting, the false security setting, all of that is really, really interesting. And it's definitely, the key to creating tension is to create that problem or conflict that the protagonist has to solve and create a sense of urgency by giving us the deadline, the foreshadowing, the contrast, the pacing, all of that good stuff. And it's a lot to think of. It's a lot to do. And again, I'm saying just do a couple of these things right and you're golden. You don't want to stuff every single thing into chapter 1 at all. And especially, I really think that foreshadowing is one of those, I think, unsung heroes of writing. I think there used to be so much more foreshadowing, and now I think we almost forget to use foreshadowing, and I think it can be such a crucial tool. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because foreshadowing in chapter 1 is a super powerful way to build anticipation and intrigue. And I'm going to tell you how we can create that foreshadowing without hitting the reader over the head with it. So let's talk ways to create foreshadowing. One of the really strong ways you can create foreshadowing is using symbolic objects, right? So you're introducing objects or symbols that become important later in the story. And by describing it in the appropriate way and putting just enough interest on it and focus on it, for a short time, you can make the reader super intrigued. So for example, you're describing a character doing something and they're wearing a key on a leather cord around their neck. And you describe this key, and that's just the one thing that you've chosen to describe. Well, now the reader's going, okay, this key might be the literal key to some kind of mystery, right? Pretty interesting. So another thing that you can do to really put the stress on what's important is you're using character actions. So the character's performing actions that foreshadow future events. So let's take this same character that we had wearing this key. Okay, so if they're nervously fiddling with it, we're now putting more stress on the fact that this key is kind of important. So this is going to build up to the reveal that we're going to have later on in the book. Another thing that you can do is you can have those setting descriptions. When a character's in a specific setting, the way you describe the setting can alert the reader to the fact that this setting is going to be important in some way. So pretty interesting. Also, again, the dialogue can create some kind of ambiguity. Remember that good dialogue has double meanings. It has the unsaid as well as the said. It has characters lying to each other. It has incomplete statements. It has lying by omission. All of these things can definitely be leveraged to, create that really fun foreshadowing. You can also create flashbacks, oddly enough, to hint at events that occurred in the past that could become important later in the story. I would say that in chapter 1, though, you might be trying to avoid those flashbacks unless we've really managed to pace it really, really well. And then there's the dramatic irony where there's a situation where the reader knows something that the character doesn't. And this creates a sense of tension and anticipation. And it's really hard to do this right, but if it's done correctly, it is so rewarding for the reader. So the key to creating this foreshadowing in chapter 1 is just to give hints. You're just giving hints without giving away too much, without beating us over the head. You're going to create that sense of anticipation and intrigue that's going to keep the reader engaged throughout the rest of the novel. Important thing, though, and this is, where I'm going to be mentioning something that I'll be touching on much more in depth in my Writing Coach on Demand bonus materials. You need to keep reminding us of some of the stuff that you've foreshadowed. If not, it's going to come out of left field. And I'm going to be talking about how to do that properly in my bonus materials. But at least I gave you that extra little hint that you do need to do. Here are some of the most common mistakes, speaking of mistakes that you want to avoid, that many authors make when writing chapter 1 of their novel. I want you to make sure that when you have written chapter 1, let it rest a little bit and write more stuff, write the rest of your novel. And then I want you to go back and revisit that chapter 1, because there are some things that might start to stand out to you. Things that you don't necessarily see until you've gotten more of your novel done. One example of one of the things that you're going to finally see that could be a problem is that maybe your novel's starting in the wrong place. And this has happened to me where I started my novel somewhere I felt really strongly about starting with kind of a prologue, and that was a mistake. And I had beta readers telling me, you know what? You really don't need to start here. You can start later on in the novel. And they were absolutely right. So many times authors begin their novel in the wrong place, too early or too late. It is so important to find the right starting point that's going to grab the reader's attention and set up the story properly. And all of these elements that I mentioned in this podcast, like make sure that that scene has those elements. And again, if you're doing the From Idea to Published in 6 Months course, you're going to have a literal checklist as to, is my first chapter doing everything it needs to do? So you'll be a lot more confident about the fact that your first chapter is working well and that you're keeping those promises beyond. Now, look at your chapter 1 once you've written more and once everything's, going on, and make sure you have enough conflict, because one of the major mistakes that authors make when writing chapter 1 is that they have a lack of conflict and tension. Without that conflict and tension, it is so hard to hook the reader. So many great writers I know are having too much description, and we're sitting there getting description, and there's no conflict. They're just kind of establishing the scene. And while it's beautifully written, I don't feel the motivation to keep reading because there's no sense of urgency. There's no sense of what does my character want that they don't have. This overly descriptive language is massive problematic issue number 1, right? Too many writers think that good writing is good description. And yeah, it's beautifully done. But I know that setting the scene is important, but too much of it bogs down your first chapter. It makes it hard to follow, and it really kills your pacing. So that's really, really important. And of course, the other thing that kills your pacing is the info dumping. Too much information, too much backstory, too much historical detail in the first chapter can totally be overwhelming and confusing. And honestly, if you're not invested in the story yet, you're like, why do I need to learn this information? Especially if it's not even historical, it's more like, made up world. Like, why am I getting invested in this complex made up world if I don't even care about the characters who live in that world? So it's very important to reveal that type of information pretty gradually throughout the story on a need to know basis, i.e., when you need to know it. Also, massive issue. I talked about too much, exposition, too much, descriptive language without this clear goal for the protagonist. So if I see your protagonist sitting there and they're observing things and they're mildly uncomfortable or they're dissatisfied or whatever, but they don't have this clear, massive goal or motivation, that's going to be problematic. The reader's not going to stay engaged. And if you are on my TikTok, you might want to look. I have a video about goals versus motivation. And I think it's a really important point for you to see what the difference between those things are. And again, this is something that you have in the course that is really, really useful, one of those super important messages. But you need the protagonist to have that clear goal or motivation, because if not, why are we engaged? Why do we care what happens to them? I talked about too much exposition. Yeah, the first chapter should reveal really important information about the character's setting and conflict, but you don't want to tell us too much. You want us to be shown in some really economical language. You want us to be shown in the most elegant, spare, and pared down way possible. So when you're looking at your chapter 1, get it as short as you can. As short as you can to get us to dive in as fast as we can. That's the goal. And also, lack of a strong narrative voice. So many of you are so busy establishing all these things in chapter 1 that you don't think about this strong narrative voice. That's also super essential, not only in engaging the reader and telling them who you are as an author, but also setting the tone of the story. So that is really, really crucial. And that's something that you totally don't want to forget to put in there without putting in too much and while maintaining that powerful, powerful hook. All right, I don't want to overload you. I mean, this is like a first chapter. I don't want to overload you with too many details, but I hope this really helps you to think about what goes into a chapter 1, what you should be careful of when writing a chapter 1, and really being kind of ruthless with yourself as to, is this the best first chapter I can possibly write? And then when you look at your chapter 1, I want you to go back and look at the rest of your writing and say, does this really keep that promise that I made with my chapter 1 of, this is so well written, this is so spare, the pacing's so great, the tone is so wonderful. Do I maintain that throughout the novel? Ouch. That's a really important thing to do. And if you're a Writing Coach on Demand member, you're going to get more on that in the bonus materials. So head over to those right away. If you're not yet a Writing Coach on Demand person and you want to sign up, you'll go to creativeandwritingcoach.com and you will see that option to sign up for that. And otherwise, onlineCoursesForWriters.com, and you will find from idea to published in 6 months, my master class that I'm so excited about. And you'll be looking out for my newsletter that you get every week with more writing inspiration and writer life inspiration. I hope that everything's going really well in your work in progress. And again, if there's any question you have for me as a writing coach, please ping me, email me, and you can always set up a free 15-minute call to see what writing coaching can do for you. Thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.